I have known myself best in my studio, sitting at the wheel making pots. This space has been more of a church to me than any church I ever belonged to. It is where I cannot hide from myself, my past, my present, my mistakes, or my potential. I decided to look at my life through pieces and parts of different developmental theories and through the words and ideas of potter and poet M.C. Richards. She wrote a book called Centering, in Pottery, Poetry, and the Person. Her words were my companion and guide on this project, and I will quote her throughout. Richards: the toughest thing to learn comes at the very beginning, if you are learning to throw on the potter's wheel, the centering of the clay. Because I grew up in a high-control religion, an egocentric religious faith, as Plotkin describes, centering was something that I was taught to outsource. I was taught that my natural, felt center could not be trusted. As a young child, I learned that my eternity, my sexuality, my integrity, and my worth were dependent on a set of beliefs, behaviors, and a deity that randomly made decisions about who was in and who was out. Richards: most of us have been brainwashed to think that knowledge and security make the world go round. As a child, I found my security in the religion of my family and community. This structure was both a protective factor and a risk factor. My parents had a stable marriage, and we had no housing or food insecurities. I also had a group of adults beyond my family who cared about me. My dad used to tell me that I could be anything I wanted to be, even the President of the United States, and this was in the 1970s. The risk in my faith community was the trauma-inducing fear I had from the teachings I received at a very young age about hell, demons, and the impending apocalypse. When I was little, I was often afraid I'd stop breathing in my sleep, and I was worried that I hadn't prayed the prayer of salvation correctly and I would die in my sleep and go to hell. To this day, when I suddenly experience an empty street or space that seems like it should have people, I wonder if the rapture has happened and God took everyone and left me behind. I have long since abandoned these beliefs, but this thinking has well-worn neural pathways. When I was about 8 or 9, my oldest brother, 6 years older than me, started experimenting with drugs. I found out about it before my parents did, and he told me that if I told them, they would make me move away. I believed him and lived with that secret for years, even after my parents found out. My brother's drug problem escalated, and our family struggled in silence. I witnessed violence between my brother and my dad. My parents had him arrested for stealing from a neighbor, and I saw the police take him away. They threw him out of the house for a while because tough love was the approach the church was teaching of how to handle wayward children. There was no mental health care offered or asked for. This was the 80s. I went from middle childhood to adolescence during these years. Seeing the amount of pain and anguish my parents experienced, I determined to never be a disappointment to them. Our family's privilege as white people and our wealth as upper middle class members of the community afforded my brother the opportunity to attend rehab, first of many times, and to attend summer school so he could get his diploma instead of his GED. The impact of all of this on me was a profound fear of abandonment and perhaps some parentification or codependency, as I felt it was my mission to somehow undo the impact of my brother's behavior on my parents by being the good kid. I did live as a normal teenager, and I experimented with drinking and sex, but I navigated a lot of complicated situations on my own because the risk of being found out was overwhelming to me. My resilience was my ability to source older friends outside of my family and church circles who helped me find the resources I needed. When I look at James Marsh's identity theory, I ultimately ended up in identity foreclosure at this stage of development. Identity foreclosure is when someone accepts a set of values, skills, and goals that someone else has assigned to them without really questioning it. And according to Plotkin's OASIS stage of development, from an egocentric standpoint, both of my brothers rebelled and I ultimately conformed. M.C. Richards says, "It is difficult to stand forth in one's growing if one is not permitted to live through the stages of one's unripeness, clumsiness, unreadiness, as well as one's grace and aptitude. Love provides a continuous environment for the revelation of one's self, so that one can yield to life without fear and embarrassment. There was no stage of emerging adulthood for me. At age 19, I started dating a friend of my parents who was 13 years older than me. I met him when I was 16, and he began pursuing me when I was 18. This relationship was encouraged and celebrated by everyone in my life who was in the church. Looking at it now and understanding myself developmentally as a 16-year-old, I believe he groomed me. This happens a lot in many high-control religious environments. At age 20, between my sophomore and junior year of undergrad, we got married. M.C. Richards writes, as a dancer shifts his position, he keeps his balance. He does this by taking his center with him. He shifts his center of gravity, reestablishing his equilibrium in the very instant he has leapt. Otherwise, he will fall and hurt himself. I shifted my center from daughter and student to wife and mother by age 22. My center was not on center, but I continued to raise the walls of my wobbly life as best I could. Part of my spiritual practice in my early adulthood was journaling conversations with God. Perhaps if I had not waited until our 25th year of marriage to read all those words I had written, I would not have stayed in it as long as I did. I married someone who I had nothing in common with aside from our practiced faith. His religious scrupulosity was a risk factor in our home, and it caused many conflicts between us as a couple, how we raised our children. Protective factor was my parents' close relationships with my kids. The busy years of family and church obligations left little time for me to ponder my wobbly pot of a life. I was raising my kids mostly on my own as their father got more satisfaction out of work, put his time and attention and energy there. Although I was bored and lonely, I was discouraged from going back to school for more education due to a lack of time and resources. My resilience in this time, when I felt very stuck, was again friends outside of the church, and also books. I was a prolific reader in my late 20s and 30s, early 30s. During this time of my life, I'm reminded of Vygotsky's idea of the zone of proximal development. I needed the scaffolding of my community to pursue growth or wholeness. That was not only not available, it was admonished. I was told to be grateful for what I had, and that wanting more was sinful and selfish, and that my best offering to the world was as wife, mother, and volunteering in the church. Preconceptions about what is and what is not possible are as dangerous in the crafts as they are in other areas of behavior. M.C. Richards. The churches I attended and my kids' schools got hours and hours of free labor from me. I showed up and volunteered anytime anyone asked. I kept myself busy. The busyness was my drug. What I learned from this time that I will take into practice as a therapist is that our society praises the people who do the most, but that doing can serve as an excellent camouflage for underlying problems of unresolved grief and trauma. Just like all wobbly pots fail and drugs can go from helping to hurting, my busyness and avoidance of my off-centered life caught up with me. I believe I had reached a point of allostatic overload. Richards. Part of the excitement is that there are forms one cannot risk without collapse, nor can we be fulfilled without the fire. We must be brave and skillful and prudent. A certain amount of mistreatment may give us an interesting surface, but too much rough handling will ruin us. We are perishable. In 2013, I turned 40. I had been suffering from headaches for about 8 years, and they were getting increasingly worse. 3 different types of doctors were dismissive of my symptoms. As I sat in the 4th doctor's office, months after my 40th birthday, this neurologist was about to also turn me away. When I began to cry, she suggested that I should seek psychiatric help. When I got mad and raised my voice, she finally listened. An MRI revealed a tennis ball-sized brain tumor. What I learned from this experience is that our healthcare system is broken. It was my risk factor, and I was privileged enough to have health insurance. As a woman, I was dismissed by male and female doctors who've participated in the patriarchy and sexism. But because I'm white, I had the privilege of my anger being listened to. Richards. According to ancient teaching, man has 3 ears. The outer organ, which bears the name ear, but which does not hear anything. The inner ear, with all its intricate resonating devices, which connects the brain to the rest of the body and tells us what sound the ether is carrying. And the whole man, from the top of his head to the soles of his feet, and from his heart to his intellect, who hears the meaning of what the sound is saying. For the first 40 years of my life, I relied on that outer ear that can't actually hear anything, and I silenced my inner knowing. That day in the doctor's office, I not only shouted at her to listen to me, but something inside me also shouted at myself. I think it was saying, "You're off-center, and it's making you sick." During an 11-hour surgery, my neurosurgeon removed my benign meningioma tumor. In the months of recovery that followed that surgery, I began waking up to my wobbly pot of a life. I saw my children through new eyes. They were traveling down paths in life that I had chosen for them from my egocentric way of living, not ones they sought for themselves. I also realized that my marriage was failing. I told my then husband that we needed help, but he dismissed it as me not being recovered from my surgery. I texted a pastor at my church asking for a recommendation of a marriage counselor. He never replied. Our friends knew we weren't okay, and they kept their distance. In my journals from this time, I quoted Psalm 13:1. King David was afraid that his enemies were about to overtake him, and God felt unavailable. He said, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart?" God didn't answer me then either, and I stayed in that life for 5 more years. Part of this spiritual awakening that happened over the next 5 years included making space for clay again in my life. I had been away from my studio for too long. Psychologist Dr. George Bonanno has dedicated much of his career to understanding trauma and resilience. He uses the term coping ugly to describe the messy way people tend to find a way forward. That describes that period of time for me. I drank a little more. I swore a little more. I began to allow myself to imagine a different life. I questioned long-held beliefs and expanded who and what I was listening to and reading. I realized that my faith and my marriage were so intertwined I could not leave one without leaving the other. Neither of them could stand alone. And I heard a voice from within me answering the question I asked 5 years before, say, "It's been long enough." And the biggest revelation to me was that voice was my own. My words, the younger versions of myself had written, were coming from my own center. They were written by me to this older version of me. I was my own center and my own resilience. The culminating event of my first marriage was a scary incident with my husband's firearm in the middle of an argument, and I took it from him and tried to hide it in my kiln. And that night, I walked out of that marriage and that life. From a practical standpoint, my protective factor was again my parents. They provided financially and with housing for me and my college-age daughter who left with me until I got on my feet. The risk factor was my lack of an employable resume from the decades of mothering and volunteering and my undergrad degree in fine art, and the instability of my soon-to-be ex-husband. My resilience came from my studio and, again, my community outside of the church. I believe I made a way for myself to enter the wild orchard stage that Plotkin talks about. I believe that's where I am now. As I think about my life in terms of my ongoing development, as well as the help I hope to offer future clients, I'm again taken back to MC Richards. She says, "It was a centering problem, how to bring elements into the whole which could move in a variety of ways without falling apart. This process can occur only with plastic substance. It cannot occur if elements are unyielding." There is so much to learn about life from the potter's wheel. Making beauty from chaos, finding the center, trial by fire. By touching one part of the pot, you impact the whole thing as it moves through your hands. Centering oneself can happen for many people inside of faith traditions and spiritual practices. It didn't for me. I am still working on rebuilding a sense of spirituality that works for me. I hope to continue my post-traumatic growth and take all of this forward in my life and in my practice as an art therapist. And finally, I'll close with more words from MC Richards. How do we get ourselves out in the open? How do we wake up? My thoughts began to pull from inside outward. As the form of my concentration expanded, taking in more and more of the actualities of my life, other feelings began to swell. I believe there is a potter's truth here. If I begin at the center, firmly and gently, and if I open my clay, firmly and gently, pulling the walls out from the center, opening wider and wider, as wide as the clay will allow, this crescent will form within me like a grace. If I make this act gently and firmly and unconsciously, like a craftsman, ably handling his material, I will make something useful and beautiful. It does not take long if you know what you are doing, but some of us serve a lengthy apprenticeship.